What if I told you that one of the greatest empires the world has ever seen was about to unravel, all because of a tax on tea? It sounds, well, kind of crazy, right? But that is exactly what happened. This is the story of how a simple dispute over a cup of tea spiraled into the birth of a brand new nation. So that's the big question, isn't it? How on earth did this happen? How did people who were, for all intents and purposes, proud British subjects turn on their king and their country in what was really a blink of an eye, historically speaking? Well, let's dive in and trace the steps that took them from pride to full-blown protest.
You have to understand, this was a massive transformation. For over 150 years, the American colonies were British to the core. Most people living there would have proudly told you they were loyal subjects of the crown. So what went so wrong so fast? Well, like a lot of stories, this one started with money.
At the heart of it all was a huge pile of debt. Britain had just fought the incredibly expensive 7 Years' War. You might know it as the French and Indian War. And when the bill came due, London looked across the Atlantic and saw dollar signs. Their logic seemed simple enough. Hey, we fought this war to protect you guys, so it's time for you to help pay for it. And Parliament's plan to get that money was, well, not subtle. They just unleashed a whole cascade of new taxes. I mean, look at this timeline. 1764, 1765, 1767, boom, boom, boom. For the colonists, this felt like a constant barrage, one slap in the face after another from a government thousands of miles away that just didn't seem to get it. It wasn't just about the cash, it was this feeling of relentless pressure.
And out of that frustration came this incredibly powerful rallying cry. Their argument was pretty fundamental. How can a parliament, where we don't have a single elected person to speak for us, have the right to just take our money? This wasn't just a complaint about taxes anymore. This was a direct challenge to the very authority of the British government.
And this slide, right here, shows the massive disconnect. The colonists were demanding direct representation. They wanted their own people sitting in Parliament, voting on their behalf. But Parliament's response was this idea of virtual representation. They basically said, oh, don't worry, our members represent all British subjects everywhere. You can imagine how that went over. To the colonists, it was just an absurd and frankly insulting excuse.
So, all that anger finally boiled over on a cold night in December 1773. Britain had kept a tax on tea really just to prove a point that they could, and in response, a group of colonists, disguised as Mohawk warriors, stormed the ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. The value of that tea in today's money? Over $1 million. This was no small protest. This was a massive, expensive act of defiance.
And that was the point of no return. King George and Parliament were absolutely livid. They didn't see the Boston Tea Party as a protest. They saw it as an open insurrection, and they decided they were going to make a brutal example out of Massachusetts.
So, Parliament passed these laws that the colonists immediately nicknamed the Intolerable Acts, and they were designed to punish. Boston's port was slammed shut, which crippled their entire economy. The local government was just dissolved. And get this, British officials accused of crimes would now be sent back to Britain for trial, where they were almost certain to get off easy. This was punishment on a whole other level.
But here is the critical thing you have to understand. Britain's whole strategy completely, utterly backfired. The idea was to isolate Massachusetts, to make them an example and scare everyone else into line. But what happened was the exact opposite. The other colonies looked at how harsh these acts were and were horrified. It lit a fire of unity and solidarity that just wasn't there before.
And that solidarity quickly took real physical form. In September 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies, only Georgia didn't make it, all gathered in Philadelphia for what they called the First Continental Congress. They weren't just 13 separate colonies anymore. They were starting to act like one. They organized a massive boycott of British goods, and crucially, started to train their own militias.
Now, even then, most people were still hoping the king would see reason and back down. He didn't, and that brings us to the exact moment where years of protest turned into open war on a fateful morning in April of 1775.
The British general in Boston, Thomas Gage, got orders to march out, arrest rebel leaders Sam Adams and John Hancock, and grab a stash of weapons hidden in the town of Concord. So writers like Paul Revere fanned out to warn everybody. And here's a cool little detail. He wasn't yelling, "The British are coming," because, well, they were British. The warning was much more specific. The regulars are coming.
as in the regular army.
As dawn broke on the Lexington town green, about 70 colonial militiamen found themselves facing down 700 British regulars. Someone, and to this day we don't know who, fired a shot. When the smoke cleared, 8 colonists were dead. The British then marched on to Concord, but there, at a place called North Bridge, the colonial Minutemen were ready, and this time they fired back. The war had begun.
But the real shock came during the British march back to Boston. All day long, thousands of local farmers and militiamen just harassed the British column, firing from behind trees and stone walls. By the time the Redcoats finally stumbled back into the city, they had suffered almost 300 casualties. It was a stunning loss. The message couldn't have been clearer. This was not going to be some easy police action.
So now the war was on. And when the Second Continental Congress met, the whole mood had changed. The question on the table wasn't about their rights as Englishmen anymore. The question was now, should we create a new nation entirely?
One of the first things they did was create a Continental Army, and their choice for commander-in-chief was a bit of a surprise, a 43-year-old Virginia planter named George Washington. So, why him? Well, he certainly looked the part, but more importantly, he was from Virginia. Picking him was a brilliant political move to make sure the biggest and richest colony was all in on the fight.
And just a few weeks later, at the Battle of Bunker Hill, the new colonial army proved just how tough it could be. Now, technically, the British won the battle, they took the hill, but they suffered over 1,000 casualties doing it. A British officer famously said afterward, "Another victory like this and we're finished." The price of winning was so incredibly high, it felt like a loss. It proved these farmers could really fight.
But even with the fighting, a lot of colonists were still on the fence about making a final break with Britain. That all changed in January 1776, thanks to a little pamphlet called Common Sense, written by a guy named Thomas Paine. It was an absolute sensation, selling over 120,000 copies in a matter of months. Paine didn't mince words. He called the king a royal brute and laid out a simple, powerful argument that independence wasn't just an option, it was the only logical path forward. That pamphlet was like a lightning bolt. It turned doubters into revolutionaries almost overnight.
And with public opinion now shifting so dramatically, Virginia's Richard Henry Lee stood up in Congress on June 7th and proposed a formal resolution with these electrifying words. That was it. Independence was now officially on the table.
Congress put together a committee to write a formal declaration, and a young delegate from Virginia named Thomas Jefferson ended up writing most of it. On July 4th, 1776, they adopted the final draft, which opened with this immortal line, an idea so powerful it would literally change the course of human history.
56 men stepped up to sign that document, and you have to understand what they were doing. Every single one of them was committing high treason against the British crown. If this revolution failed, they weren't just going to lose their fortunes. They were going to be hunted down, tried, and hanged. This was the ultimate all-or-nothing gamble.
And the impact was immediate and visceral. When George Washington had the Declaration read aloud to his troops in New York City, they didn't just cheer. An enraged mob went and tore down a giant statue of King George III. And what did they do with it? They melted it down and turned it into 42,000 musket balls to fire back at the king's army. I mean, talk about sending a message.
Now, the war was far, far from over. There were years of brutal fighting still ahead. But the choice had been made, and that leaves us with one last big question. When you look back at this incredible chain of events, from a tax protest to a full-blown declaration for a new nation, what do you think? Was American independence an inevitable destiny, or was it just history's greatest and most successful gamble?